Normally when I do a video like this, I like to build up to an overall point that I have, and then try and like hammer in with that point at the very end. I do that because it makes the most sense to me from basically a creative standpoint. It's the show your work, build up to a point, and then hit the point. As if this was a rumination analysis, basically, as if this was something that I was trying to do, in front of a class or as an essay or, as for the general edification and entertainment of someone. But I have a lot of notes, and I mean, I have a lot of notes on this game. So much so that I accidentally put it on the ground. So rather than do that and force people to crawl through the entire video, I have no idea how long this one's going to be. Who knows, maybe it'll be like 40 minutes. I thought I'd go ahead and give my big thought right at the beginning, and then we'll proceed as if nothing happened. So I'm going to give you my big thought right at the beginning, my grand unifying theory about Fallout 4, and then we'll talk about everything in between and kind of help to justify that point, okay? Now, the problem is this is kind of hard to explain, because if I just say, blah, then that doesn't get across the point. See, blah, in this case, is this shouldn't have been an open-world game. But that doesn't really get across the point. I'm not saying Fallout shouldn't be an open-world game. I'm saying Bethesda, as of Skyrim, basically, shouldn't be making open-world games. Okay, there's the hammer. I've dropped it. It's actually difficult for me to truly explain what I mean by this. This is one of those vague ideas, but the overall construction... Skyrim started this, but Fallout 4 just absolutely hammered me in the face with this. Because what Fallout 4... See, okay, let me rewind a little bit. When I play through a game, usually I can understand why certain flaws exist, Sometimes someone tries an idea that's difficult to pull off. Sometimes there's localization issues. Sometimes there's budget issues. Sometimes there's time issues. Sometimes there's all of the above, you get the idea. So, like, for example, when I look at Dragon Age 2, the flaws in that game are very easily explainable because they had, like, 11 months or whatever it was to make that game, and so it's like, well, yeah, I mean, you can only do so much with that kind of a time, especially given the fact that there wasn't intended to be a sequel to Origins. So, I get it, I'm with it. With a game like Fallout 4, I look at this and I'm like, well, they had years of work, tons of backing, no timeline budget, no budget. I mean, Bethesda, the publisher, has been funding Bethesda Softworks, or whatever they're called, the actual developers, for years, so they can just do their own thing. Why is Fallout 4 so flawed? Now, before people start jumping down my throat, I do still think Fallout 4 is a net positive. I really do. Replaying it this time, I actually enjoyed it more than I did my first time, especially since now I knew what the hell was up with the leveling system. And I've decided to make a conscious choice not to go and do every single thing that I consider to be a mistake or a flaw in the gameplay, because that would be basically a completely separate video, and people who are better at that than me have already gone over that. This is going to be my usual rumination style. Stuff I feel is worth talking about, stuff that I feel like I can discuss with at least some degree of severity. But I'm going through this game and I'm like, well, I enjoy this, but then I don't. But then I enjoy this, but then I don't. And while they do one thing very, very well with the map, and they do, and I'll discuss that later, the actual open-world RPG aspect of the game felt extremely lacking to me. Like, here's the analogy I used. I actually kind of gave a sneak preview on my stream for this. I feel like Bethesda would make better short story writers than novel writers. Okay, the Bethesda team... When I say Bethesda in this case, by the way, I'm specifically referring to the team that worked on Fallout 4. Not the team that worked on Skyrim, or Oblivion, or Morrowind, or anything else, okay? The Fallout 4 team. I just don't feel like saying the Fallout 4 team every time, okay? So we're going to truncate that to the Bethesda. So when I say Bethesda, you think the Fallout 4 team. Okay, ready? Bethesda. Alright, perfect. Bethesda, I feel... when you write a short story... all you really have to be concerned with is what is happening within that short story. You can involve the past, you can set up the future, but really a short story is something that doesn't have to have long-term arcs, undercurrent themes. It doesn't have to have a strong core trunk to connect the rest of the story. It's a short story. It's right here. Boom. Done. It's the definition of a short story. And I felt like Fallout 4 was like 10, 12, 30, I don't know how many, but a bunch of short stories that all happen to be happening in the same world. Now, if I was being generous, I would say, well, that's the point. But I'm not being generous because I don't think that was done on purpose. I think that Bethesda makes better set pieces, better moments, than overarching games. Because here's the thing. If I sat back and really thought about the overarching themes and, the trunk, the things that all the rest of the game, story-wise and gameplay-wise, revolves around, I could do that in, well, a huge number of games. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't come up with one for Fallout 4. Not really. There's a couple of themes that come up in individual, short stories. There's just specific quest lines where a theme is very strong in that. But then that theme goes away and is not referenced again or has anything to do with the rest of the game. You see where I'm going with this? This feels like maybe this should be a mission hub kind of a game instead. All right, now go do this particular short story equivalent of games, and you go or of missions, and you go do this little quest arc, and it's kind of self-contained, and it really only has to do with its own little thing. Then you return to the mission hub, and it's like, okay, I've done that. Now I go do this mission hub, and I come here and do that. Rather than having this main plot line, side plot lines, open world kind of feeling to it. Now, I also have to admit, at least part of this is because I feel like Fallout 4 has done Radiant quests worse than I have ever seen. That might be an exaggeration, because I might not be thinking of an example right now that's worse, but Fallout 4's Radiant quests, in my opinion, are very, very bad. They are the purest example of padding. And so much of the side content is just that. Now, there is actual real side content, going through vaults, there's 4 companion quests, there's a couple of side quests that have to do with each of the major factions, that kind of stuff. But once you've gone through that stuff, the massive bulk of additional content for fleshing out the rest of the world is Radiant quests. I've talked this over with several people to try and get different people's opinions. I don't like to just give just my opinion in a circumstance where I'm obviously biased. And I am biased. I am biased against Radiant quests. I find them to be lazy. Not lazy programming-wise. There's some very brilliant programming and design that goes into a Radiant quest. But I mean lazy writing-wise. Because all you have to write is basically nothing. Hey, there's a new settlement that needs help. Please go check it out. Let me mark it on your map. Thanks. Thanks for helping us out. Oh, and I found another settlement that is so lazy writing-wise, and I don't like that. But, like I said, that's why I am biased. So I try to get some other people's buy-in, and I try to get some people who would challenge my opinions. But even after that, we all came up with the same general result, if for different reasons. The idea being, and I posit this question to you as well, is there a point? Is there a good use in Radiant quests? Now, I'm not saying could we take Radiant quests and use them in another manner, because that's been done before. To give you just an idea that came off just right off the top of my head just now as I was saying that sentence, why not have it so each Radiant quest counts as like one, it doesn't matter, a token basically, for a faction that you're working for? I don't mean like rep. I mean like show a visual change the audio, change the music of the area, change, like you've got this dilapidated area, and then you go do a Radiant quest, and you come back, and now there's another NPC there, and you go do another Radiant quest, and you come back, now there's like 3 more NPCs there. You could show building up an organization. I guess Skyrim kind of did this, but you could show up building up an organization and show the presence of the Radiant quests having an impact on things and make that work, maybe? But if I'm being 100% honest with myself, I still look at that and think, why not use scripted quests? Why not use, I'm just going to say this with my own biased term, because I am biased, I'm going to be honest about it. Why not use real quests? Radiant quests are not real quests. Radiant quests are go and make it up yourself, If I wanted to do that, I can do that right up here. I don't need a video game to do that with, But again, that is my bias. I know I'm not, I know I am not with the common thought on that one. Anyways, regardless of the Radiant quests thing, though, I really felt like this game showcased to me why this shouldn't have been an open world game, and why it, in my opinion, failed as an open world RPG. Now, to add something, because I already had someone come at me about this, like, hang on, are you saying that we should accept the fact that, and give Fallout 4 points for the fact that it's a good mission hub game? And I was like, no, absolutely not. It needs to be acknowledged. They sold this as an open world game. They sold this as an open world RPG, and in my opinion, they failed on both accounts. That should be denoted. If I was doing a review, they would get negatives for that. But that doesn't change my other fairly pragmatic perspective, which is now, all the DLCs come out. Fallout 4 isn't moving. All that could ever happen for Fallout 4 now is mods. So Fallout 4 is as it is, and it's not changing. If you are going to try and enjoy the game, going into it with a different mentality might actually help you enjoy it, like it helped me this new playthrough. All right, now I'm going to go back to the beginning of my notes. So that's my big preamble, okay? I've probably lost all of you now that I've said that. But let me go back. Let me rewind a bit. So, for those of you still listening, I'm about to lose the rest of you. Now, I haven't exactly been quiet about this opinion, but I do have another opinion that's just very unpopular amongst Fallout fans. I like Fallout 3. Go ahead, hate me. It's okay, I have heard it all, trust me. I like Fallout 3. I think Fallout 3 is a good post-apocalypse game. I think it has good atmosphere. I think that its DLCs are fantastic, and arguably are expansions, and I think there's some good world building if you were to separate it from the rest of Fallout. It is a massively flawed game, with lots of issues, especially if you're just looking at vanilla, but it's worth noting that unlike, say, Oblivion, which I mod to hell and back, like when I was doing the Oblivion roleplay, I had like 70 mods for that game. When I was doing the Fallout roleplay, I had one. I don't really need to mod Fallout 3 to enjoy it, but it is a very flawed game. Have I lost the rest of you yet? I was hyped for Fallout 4 is what I'm trying to say. Fallout 3 was something I enjoyed. Fallout New Vegas was something I loved. And even though this wasn't Obsidian, I was really excited about a new Fallout game. And admittedly, the way they did the marketing for Fallout 4, that great press release, and I actually covered this live, if you remember, and the whole build-up to that, and, the Fallout Shelter coming out, like, during the press release, that was brilliant marketing, if I'm being honest with myself. And it did generate a lot of hype and a lot of hoip for me for Fallout 4. I was pumped for Fallout 4 when it finally came out, and I couldn't wait to stream it live. And if you actually were there for that live, for that premiere run of Fallout 4, you understand how my opinion just plummeted quickly. Maybe some of that's on me. I'm not going to deny or argue with that. But I have always personally felt that the argument of, oh, well, your expectations were just too high, is a little bit too dismissive of an argument. It ignores the reality. Because, in my experience, just personally speaking, that hype level, that fake expectation, lasts for about 10 minutes into a game. Then you just kind of settle into the, okay, it's actually here, it's actually happening. And, like, the hype just plummets. And then you get down to, you're excited, you're still interested, but you're no longer like, oh, this is going to be the best thing ever. You're just like, okay, I can't wait to see what happens next. And if at that point it fails to follow through, you see where I'm going with this? Now, let's go ahead and say a couple of things in favor of Fallout 4. I call Fallout 4 a net positive game. It might be the best example of that term, net positive, I've ever seen. For those of you who don't, I've never really talked about this before. My friend Guido has actually mentioned I should do a video about this, and I do intend to. The idea here is, let's say there's a game where 50 things are wrong with it, okay? 50 little things. But it does like 5 things really, really, really well. So well that each of those things is the equivalent of like 11 negative things, okay? You with me? So in the mathematics of that, that would still be a net positive. Even though it's a game that is flawed, even though it's a game that irritates me or pisses me off at times, I still enjoyed it long term. Make sense? Net positive. So Fallout 4 has got to be the best example of that ever, because it is such an immensely flawed game. Massively, horrifically flawed game. And yet there are so much good in it. So let's talk about what Fallout 4 really did well, in my opinion. First of all, I actually have this note here. It's actually, the way I originally wrote it was MMMV, but that's actually not accurate. It's audio, visuals, moments, characters. Okay, these are the 4 tenets, ironically, that Fallout 4 did very well, in my opinion. If you look at most of the set pieces the scripted sequences and the little mission things that I referenced earlier, all four of those pieces are prominently on display. The title is a brilliant example of this. Now, the title isn't actually a brilliant example of what I'm talking about, but you know what I mean, right? Einen Zur's music starts playing, and it's this swelling, amazing music, and it's like, oh my god, this is fantastic, and like the armor, and you can see so much in the background, like the leveling system, and it's just, oh my god, powerful, right? And there's lots and lots of that really helps to make individual scenes work tremendously. Now, I say audio specifically rather than just music because there's a lot of really good audio design that really helps flesh out the setting. Nowhere is that more apparent than when you go into the Dead Sea, into the radiated wasteland of where the nuke actually hit. That, just walking through there, is beautifully atmospheric. The music, the audio, the occasional crackles, the non-stop danger, the horrific beasts that are there, and of course, the wasteland that makes the wasteland look like paradise. Every single aspect of that is brilliantly done and incredibly atmospheric. And there's a lot of sections of this game that are very, very atmospheric that I really, really love. Now, let me go ahead and say what is, for me personally, the biggest flaw of Fallout 4. And it's not the leveling system. That would probably be, I'd say, third biggest flaw. It's the lack of expansions. Now, I want to talk about this briefly, okay? In Morrowind, and Oblivion, and Skyrim, and Fallout 3, and we could count New Vegas as well, but all of those games, that's like basically all of Bethesda's library back to Morrowind. The vanilla game is good, and the expansions are amazing and really help flesh it out and really make it much more enjoyable. And I've talked before about my mentality on expansions and why I think expansions are overall a good thing. The idea being that, okay, now, the team that was working on this game, not just the company, not just some of the people, because I know some of the people working on this game also worked on previous games, but the ones who worked on this game, this engine, this setting, this story, this model, everything for this specific game, have now made the game, and they've gained enough experience, they've gotten to work together. Ideally, this doesn't always happen, of course, but ideally they now know what they're doing well enough, and they're like, okay. And they say, well, now that we have a lot of the bulk of the work done, the engine, the art design, the physics, so much of the code underpinnings of a game done, because the game's already there, now let's add on to that. And, more art design, more music, more voice acting, more writing, more content, more scripts, all that fun stuff. That's the expansion. Now, I say specifically expansion. The term expansion is basically not even used these days, unless referring to MMOs. My personal definition of an expansion is extremely gray. The idea is an expansion is a sufficient and significant introduction of the content to a work. Now, that's vague on purpose. For example, though, the two expansions to Skyrim are debatable as to whether they're DLC or expansion. Now, I say two. You get what I mean by that, right? The Vampire one and the Dragonborn one. I can't remember their names right now. Whether those are expansions or DLC, that's going to depend on your opinion. But the fact that they're in the running kind of makes my point for me. I would argue strongly that Fallout 3 and Oblivion and Morrowind all had expansions to them. So when Fallout 4 came out, and anybody who watched my stream knows I mentioned that. I'm like, well, okay, this is a barely net positive game, just on vanilla. And I actually pretty much said this word for word. I'm sure mods and expansions will help flesh this game out more. And I said that without reservation. Because for the last, like 15 years or so, something like that, some ridiculous amount of time, Bethesda has kept that model true. Good mod support, and good expansions have helped flesh out their games so much more than they originally were, I mean, name any of the games previously, and their vanilla model of that game just doesn't even compare to the one with the expansion with mods in my opinion, at least. Fallout 4 failed on both of these. This is the first and second flaw I referenced here. The first flaw is the fact that it arguably has only one expansion, and even that is heavily debatable. I did actually procure Far Harbor for this playthrough. I have a specific page of notes just for that. My final thoughts on it, it's very padded. There's a lot of empty air in the expansion. There's some good stuff in there. There's some really good stuff in there and some magnificent atmosphere. But ultimately, it felt like the same problem the rest of Fallout 4 had, just kind of smaller. Here's a set piece of awesome. then a long trek of boring and stupid, then a set piece of awesome, and then, yeah, you get my point. But that's it. That's the only one that, in my opinion, qualifies at all to even be in consideration for an expansion. The other two large DLCs are not large enough to really be even in the running for expansion, in my opinion. And the little DLCs, which is all the crafting stuff, those aren't even on the map. They didn't come out with fantastic expansions like they always have. And then their mod support is, to be as blunt as I can, terrible. Now, people have been modding Fallout 4 basically since it came out. But the developer side mod support is not that great. Especially since, I'm sorry, but Bethesda's actual mod supported site is garbage. It's got a terrible search engine. Its flags for searching through things manually are awful. I actually ended up just abandoning that site entirely. Which, I mean, some of you are going to be like, duh, you should have done this to begin with. And went over to the Nexus. But when I was combing over the Nexus, I didn't find much. Usually when I look into mods, I find stuff that's like, yeah, this is great, or I can't wait to have that. I mentioned those 70 mods I used in Oblivion. I used 8 in Fallout 4. Almost all of them were graphics related. I got the seasonal mod, just to give you an idea of what I was going for. Because I didn't see anything that actually interested me. Now, maybe that's on the community, or maybe that's on the poor support, or maybe it's on Bethesda's site being garbage. I don't know. But it means that this game has failed at two of the biggest things that have been a Bethesda standard since Morrowind. And then the third thing is the leveling system. Now, I've been debating this. Like I said, other people have explained and discussed why the gameplay of Fallout 4 kind of falls flat better than I can, I think the most common comment is the fact that it's not actually an RPG, it's a shooter with RPG elements. That's such a vague line, I don't want to say that myself as my own statement, but I certainly see why some people would think that. Because it does feel a lot more shootery and a lot less RPG-y, but the leveling system itself, I know I already commented on this during the stream, and I'm not going to go over this in too much depth, but I hate it. I absolutely despise it. It feels so backwards to me. It feels so counterintuitive to, every other leveling system I've seen ever. and like the rest of RPGs going all the way back to the NES era. And I didn't get it. It didn't click in my brain. Now that, of course, could be my fault. But even when it was fully explained to me and I understood it, all I could think of when I was looking at it is, what's the point of this? Why? Why do this? It feels like, well, I'm just going to cut off there. Let's not get into it anymore. Like I said, I'm not the best person to discuss that kind of a thing. So, I mentioned audio is one of the things they do very well. One thing Fallout 4 nailed, in my opinion, is the voice acting. We all know the joke. There's 5 voice actors in Oblivion. We all know that joke, right? Admittedly, that does bother me from time to time when replaying Oblivion. I'm not going to deny that. But this game took that voice actor problem and just flung it out the window. There is a much larger diversity of the cast, and the voice acting in general is a much higher quality. I feel like they either got better voice actors, a better voice director, or both, and really managed to actually make people feel like they were doing the lines properly. Most especially, and this was crucial, the main characters. I played this time through as a male character, and the last time through as a female character. So I have now heard, both main characters for most of the part through the game, and I do very much think that both voice actors are awesome. They do their job fantastically. They know when to be loud, they know when to be soft, they know when to just cut off their own voices. They're like there's a couple moments when they become so choked up they can't speak, and it sounds like it. It's brilliantly done, and they're not the only examples of that. Basically all the voice acting. I can't think of any real complaints I had in the voice acting through the entire game. Big A+ for me on that one. Felt kind of like the old BioWare games where they used to really care about voice acting in their games, being a major element of them. I talked about that extensively during Dragon Age Origins, for example. The intro, then, is a great example of that. Now, I know they got War Never Changes guy in order to do the newscaster, but the way he reads the news of the fact that they have confirmed reports of the nukes going off is perfect. That slow, stunned shock That realization that there's nothing he can do, and we're all gonna die, and this is just beyond his comprehension. It was perfect the way he acted it. And that intro scene was very, very powerful. And it was powerful multiple times. It was paced almost perfectly, in my opinion. Da 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 da. Life, wife slash husband, child, everything's wonderful. Ah, hello, Vault-Tec representative, voiced by Awesome. Hey, what's going on? Oh, the bombs are falling. Run! Action sequence, action sequence. Barely get under the vault in time. Nuke goes off. The one that we basically go to the crater of later in the game. And then there's like this brief period of you can catch your breath. But it's not a breather area. This is why I say the pacing is well done, because that first part was, there's that moment, that just brief moment of absolute dread. Then that turns into terror. Then the terror subsumes into quiet horror. Because just about anyone playing this game probably knows about Vault-Tec. And probably knows how Vault-Tec operates. And even if you don't, you can tell basically going through there that there's just something off. Yes, we need to have you on a routine medical check. Just get into the cryo tube. Don't ask any questions. Just get into the tube. This moment when these people are so shell-shocked, they probably aren't even fully cognizant, which is why they didn't question. I think that's actually mentioned in the game. They didn't question being put into the tubes because they just saw a nuke go off in the distance, and their eyeballs probably shouldn't be there anymore. But let's skip over the flaws in that. Again, it's a good set piece, even if it doesn't quite make that much sense. So it's like, oh God, I don't know what to do. Okay, here we are. Don't worry, we're here to take care of you. And of course, they're being betrayed. They're being brought in to be experimented on, just like every other Vault-Tec. Then, about when the player has the full realization of this, and the character has the full realization of what's going on, your significant other is shot and your child is stolen. That moment hit the hell out of me when I first saw it. Still hit me this time through. Then you get out. And then we hit that atmosphere point. The atmosphere for the crawl through the remains of Vault 111 was fantastic. It was quiet, it was chilling, it was empty, it was dreadful, it was terrifying. You get my point, right? Now here's the thing. I've been giving nothing but praise for this intro, but I do have to point out two quick flaws in this, other than the obvious logical problems of the nuke going off right there and all that fun stuff. First of all, why not more pre-war stuff? Those of you who watched my show for any length of time know that I actually posited a intro to Fallout 4 well before Fallout 4 came out, several months before Fallout 4 was even announced, actually. And it basically was the idea of you playing from a first-person perspective, someone going to a ball game, a baseball game. And the whole point of that was to visually demonstrate just how bad the pre-war society was, and to give you some playable time in that era so you could really experience it and feel it in a way that we never actually have before. It was a unique opportunity for the franchise. The idea of like watching an armed soldier pull someone out of a line and beat them and then look at you and wave jovially because this is just normal, and nobody shouts or screams because this is just a Tuesday to them. Little things like that you could have done. Instead, we get, life is good, and Vault-Tec, and oh God, run for the vault, and then that's it. And I felt that was a critical shame on their part to not explore that massive opportunity more. Then, there's the Codsworth thing. Now, I'm not even going to ask the obvious question, why is Codsworth still there, and still functional, and still combat capable, and still sentient and sapient, 210 years later? I'm not even going to get into that, because that was one of my first thoughts. How are you still here? What I want to know is, what's the purpose of Codsworth, really, other than, oh, by the way, it's been 2 centuries. This brings up a point that has been brought up by basically everyone I know who likes the Fallout series. And even the developers of Fallout 3 actually mentioned this back when Fallout 3 first came out. Fallout 3 is set 200 years after the bombs fall. Fallout 4 is set up 210 years after the bombs fall, okay? The general gist here is that take both games and shove them forward like 140 years or so. Make it about 60 years after the bombs fell. The overall atmosphere, the presentation of the post-apocalypse, the way things have evolved and turned out, would generally make a little bit more sense if it had been that a period of time rather than the whole colossal period of time. Now, there's still some things that would have to be hammered out in order to make the timeline work, but you get the idea. The amount of time that has passed is colossal and kind of insane, actually. But I digress. I digress. Um, so I have this note here, which is the first point I was going to build up the point that I have already opened this video with. But one of the things I feel with is this is an example of something I've talked about in writing many, many, many times. I've actually, when I have taught writing, creative writing, I've talked about this as well. Most writers, myself included, we all have this problem, have a thing where we want to get to the good stuff. You want to write a novel, okay, or a story or whatever, but you want to just get right into the good stuff of it. So it's like, and I'm sure you've seen this in fictional works many times, or in written works of non-professional variety, where it's like, and then the stuff happens. There's like no lead up, no build up, no establishment. Just get to it. I feel like that sort of writing was on display a lot in Fallout 4. Like I said, there's really strong moments. I keep using the word set pieces because that's what it feels like. It's like someone put a lot of care and craft into making this little diorama that from the right angle looks really cool and really, really gets across what it's trying to get across. Again, visual, audio, characters, moments. If you look at it from just about any other angle, you could see where the flaws come through, and it doesn't really fit with the other diorama, which is over here, but by itself, it's good stuff, right? There's a lot of really good moments, but the more I thought about them and the way they connected to the setting, or this game itself and its overall plot, the more I saw the framework falling apart, or rather the absence of framework, I should say. And that brings me to my overall point here of Fallout 4, which, again, I'm going to kind of give away early rather than later. Fallout 4 felt like a game I could enjoy more when I turned my brain off. For those of you who don't really understand what I mean by that, when I have full analysis mode on, even my friends can attest this. I can pick up on stuff. I can connect the dots. I can think through things. I'm very good at determining what I'm looking at. Basically, I'm not intelligent. I'm not smart by any manner, but I can look at something and be like, aha. And a lot of fictional works, when I turn analysis mode on and really crank it up, I enjoy them even more because I see how things were designed to fit together, how things were crafted to make this overarching work, and that's awesome. Sometimes when I turn analysis mode on, I enjoy things much, much less because I see the flaws much more, because I see how much the piece, movie, game, book, whatever, wasn't written very well or crafted very well or constructed very well, and you start to see the seams, you start to see the behind the scenes perspective, basically. You see the people carrying the props behind the curtain, kind of a thing, metaphorically speaking. That's what Fallout 4 was for me. The more I thought about it, the more I was like, ugh. And I didn't turn my brain off, obviously, for this playthrough, but even though I enjoyed this playthrough more, it's mostly because the moments were enjoyable, even if everything else was not. But I digress. So I like the audio when you're on your way to Concord, towards the early. It's your first actual real living human contact since, the bombs fell, basically. And I like that that's the first human interaction you have as the Vault Dweller. It's like, oh god, I've escaped, and there's Codsworth. Okay, that's great. We'll just go this way, and there's a dead person with some basic rudimentary gear on him. Okay, and I walk forward a little bit more, and there's the dog. It's like, okay, hello, Dogmeat. That's right. I couldn't even think of the dog's name. I dismissed him immediately. It's like, hey, Dogmeat. And then the first human contact you hear is gunshots. And just right off the bat, it establishes the tone. It establishes the feeling of a Fallout game, which I like. And then pretty much right after that, you get power armor after the whole Minutemen thing. Now, here's the good part of the power armor thing. My opinion, of course. I think the power armor stuff worked because it felt strong. It felt like you actually had a big old suit of power armor on, and you could do things that you couldn't normally do. And honestly, power armor's never felt that way for me in any other Fallout game ever. It's always felt like another suit of armor, nothing special. But in this game, it felt like, and I really liked that. I liked the way it was presented. It also has finite resources, the fusion cores. Oh, I know there's ways to get around that, but my point is a limited fuel source, so you have to carefully ration how you use the thing. And it's got to be repaired basically constantly, and repairing those things can be kind of tricky, and you can mod them in and out and all that fun stuff. So on the whole, I think the power armor did work, with one big exception. I think it was too limited. I think ultimately power armor was not as useful as it should have been. I think it should have made you stronger. Should have given you more armor or more damage resistance or energy resistance or something to make it more significant. Because as it was, it felt like a very clunky, very difficult to use resource that was basically a cooldown at that point, to use a common RPG term. And I would only use it for the really difficult fights that I knew were coming up. And all the other times I'd leave it bunked on the top of the roof where nobody else could get to it. I think either making the resources for it more commonplace would have helped, but I don't actually like that idea because that would have just made it like another suit of armor again. I think it should have been buffed, and I wasn't able to find any mods to do that. I'm sure there exist, I just couldn't find any. So then you get to Diamond City, kind of jumping forward here a little bit. Exposition City. They do something very, very good in Diamond City, okay? They do the Final Fantasy IV thing. Hear me out. In Final Fantasy IV was the first game I learned to talk to everybody. FF6 probably did that the best. I could actually do a whole analysis on how FF6 did that, but I know you guys are tired of hearing me talk about FF6, but you get the point. You go talk to all the NPCs so you find out what's going on, any side quests, any loot, any significant plot points that's going on. You get my point, right? You talk to everyone so you know what's going on. Fairly normal RPG stuff. In Fallout 4, especially in Diamond City, but everywhere, really, you don't have to do that. You just have to walk through the town. And every time you hear someone start talking, you just stop. And you kind of listen in on the conversation. And so a lot of that normal NPC dialogue, side quest, loot, lore, backstory, character development, plot points, all that stuff was woven into background dialogue rather than having you have to walk up to a guy and say, hey, give me a thing. And I liked that. I think that was very well done. It also encourages the player to actively go out of their way to peek into every little corner of the town or any given area they're in, because that way they can hear more of these little tidbits and get more of a full fleshed out picture of what's going on. And I think that was very well executed. So Diamond City is also where the synth issue comes up. Now, I mentioned earlier I don't think there was a theme to Fallout 4. I stand by that statement. But the closest thing we have to a theme is a very, very old sci-fi staple. And that staple is, is this AI considered to be a person? Does it have the rights of a person? The Measure of a Man thing from TNG. The Doctor went through that on Voyager. Hell, this goes back to like the 40s. This is a very old science fiction trope. So not exactly new ground there. I'm not making fun of it for that. But that's basically the synth issue in a nutshell. I don't have much else to say about it, really. The people insist the synths are not real people. Some of the synths insist they're not real people. Some of them insist they are real people. And whether or not they are or not kind of depends. I will say this. It is my opinion, based on what we see in Fallout 4, that the synths are a very clear example of droid effect, aka a sufficiently advanced intelligence, when given sufficient time and experiences, can grow to be fully sentient and sapient. Also known as the same thing human beings do when we go from being a little baby to a full-fledged adult. So, droid effect, right? And we see this demonstrated in several cases throughout the game, but that's kind of all I have to say about the synth issue. For me, it was just kind of like, okay, nothing really worth talking about there. Moving on. Let's talk about something that I actually really did like in this game, and it's probably, in my opinion, the thing they did best in Fallout 4, really. I mentioned the map design. This is probably the one big argument against the whole not open world thing, because here's how they did this, okay? So you have a main quest here, okay? Am I visible in the camera? Looks like I am. Main quest visible here. And it goes down to here, okay? Now, if you just beeline that, or if you follow the road to that, or if you take like an obvious route through this terrain through that. The terrain is designed so that there's basically one, two, and occasionally three obvious routes you can go from point A to point B. And for the first couple of chunk of quests, basically right up until you reach the center of the Commonwealth, when you hit oh, I can't think of it all of a sudden. The town that Hancock is mayor of. I can't think of the name of the town. Anyways, right up until about that point, the overall design of the map is such that as you are taking these paths, you will go by side quests. And this is some of the most brilliant stuff they've done, and I really wish they did more of this, and I hope they do more of this in Elder Scrolls 6 whenever that comes out, because it really is awesome design. You hear stuff, or you get a radio signal, or you actually come across an area that looks like it's worth investigating, or you have someone run out at you, it's like, hey, oh my god, maybe you can help me with this, or you see like a scripted event happening in the background. All of these are side quests, and this is how the game, at least until that point, gets side quests to you, the player, by you basically walking by them, because you are probably going to walk by them, because you are most likely to take this particular path to get from point A to point B. It's really excellent map design and really good organic generation of quests. The idea being that, you know, at this point the main quest becomes a trunk, and each of these side quests becomes a branch off of it. And like I said, I do think that's one of the things they did really, really well. It's just, it only happened until a certain point in time, and then it kind of fell off. As an aside, I liked the radio guy. The Confidence Man quest. You know what I'm talking about. Let's talk about Kellogg. Kellogg lives in relative luxury, but what I find most interesting is that luxury is only relative to the wasteland. Given the Institute, and I'll talk more about that later, it's interesting to me because he could live in abject, absolute luxury, even by like real life today's standards, if the Institute allowed that for him for all of his service and whatnot, but they don't, and it's kind of obvious why. The Institute never liked him from the beginning. You know, there's always that sort of elitist, oh, well, he's the dirty man doing the dirty work thing. We're the ones who are actually interested in humanity's future and all that crap. And I really like the idea that he is basically being kept in a state of artificial poverty relative to the Institute, just because screw him. Because they don't actually like him, you know. And then there's the whole cybernetics thing, extending his life, and a couple other things I'm not going to go into. But I do like the cybernetics thing because, A, it's a nice way to tie him into the previous Fallouts. You know, the She, and he was literally a kid when the NCR was signed into existence. But the other thing I like about it, and I'm going to go ahead and say something that is somewhat unpopular. I hear this comment so often lately. I hear so many people say, you know, do you think power fantasy in a game is wrong? Do you think you're tired of playing the main character of a story? And the answer is absolutely no, of course, but that's just my opinion. But one thing I have always personally liked about the Fallout games specifically, and this is true for all 5, I think, of them at this point, is that you are the guy. You are the deadliest bastard in the wasteland, of whatever wasteland you're in. You are at the top of the food chain. And the games, all of them, have gone out of the way to make that clear. In some cases, there's a reason for it. Most of the time, there isn't. I don't care if there's a reason for it, because to me, that is part of the appeal of playing a Fallout game, being on top of the food chain. I mention that because that is very, very apparent and on display in Fallout 4, with probably the least reason that there's ever been in a Fallout game for you being so amazing. And you are demonstrably someone who could basically just bulldoze through just about anything in your path. You know, no one else can actually match you. But this is how this ties into Kellogg, because he is in many ways an enemy PC. He is someone who has years and years and years and years, decades and decades of experience. He is cold-hearted, brutal, ruthless, and he has cybernetics. And all of that makes him up to your level as the player character, which I think emphasizes more than anything else what I'm trying to talk about with regards to the player character just being at the top of the food chain, you know, apex predator kind of situation. I also I very much like a couple of things about the moments with regards to him, even though there's some literary cheating there. I'll talk about that in a moment. First of all, he tells you you can leave. Not everyone gets that choice. I like that for 2 reasons. Number one, part of the reason you can leave is because the Institute overall is going to leave you alone because of Sean. Oh, spoiler alert, by the way. Um, and reason number two is because he himself, Kellogg, is pretty self aware of the fact that he does not have the option to leave. He is trackable. There's so different many ways that he could be stopped or taken down if he decided to bail on the Institute. And he knows it. He doesn't have the option to just back away. And I really feel like the voice actor got across that in his line where he's like, you have the choice I don't have. Walk away from this. Ironic considering what we end up doing in the end. And then we get to some literary cheating. There's some deliberately vague and actively misleading dialogue and terminal entries in the actual computer banks during the quests leading up to and concluding with you actually killing Kellogg. And all of it is designed to make you think that the Sean incident just happened. I have just set up, there's actually a specific line I'll never forget where it's like, I have just unloaded Sean, and now I'm going to this base, and that's the base where you find him at. You see what I mean by that? Now, that can be hand-waved away, but the reason I call that literary cheating is it's something that only serves the purpose of trying to deliberately misdirect the audience's attention in a way that we wouldn't normally suspect, because it's coming from a source that's considered absolutely reliable. In other words, imagine for a moment if in a crime novel or something, a mystery, a murder mystery, we get to hear the thoughts of the murderer, and the murderer themselves is thinking, gosh, I really hope they can catch who this murderer is or whatever. And so we, the audience, are like, well, that's obviously not the murderer because we have heard their thoughts. We know that's them, and we know that's true, and therefore we can take this as writ. And then later on, it was me! That's what I mean by literary cheating, okay? And I feel like there's a few instances of that about the Sean reveal. I feel they were trying a little bit too hard to make that a big twist. But then again, I've said for years that while I don't mind twists in my storytelling, I do feel that some games go out of the way to make them a little bit too much of a main event kind of a thing. And I do think the twist in this game is not that great. So then the Pridwin shows up, or Pridewin, or I've heard it pronounced like three other ways. It has great impact. It's really nice seeing that show up. Again, great set piece. You've just taken down Kellogg. That is basically the end of Act 1. You've taken down Kellogg, and you have avenged yourself, and you avenged your husband or wife. You can take a deep breath, and now you have no idea where Sean is, but he just unloaded him to the Institute, so the Institute is the real problem, and you open the door, exiting, and there's the fricking Pridwin, just going right across your face. Funny fact, if you don't follow the quest chain, and don't follow the most immediately available exit out of the place, unless you go through that exit, that event will never happen, and the game will basically be unable to progress after a certain point. You have to go back to the base and go out the proper exit so that the trigger happens, so that the Pridwin goes by, and then you can be like, hey, the Brotherhood's here. So, couple nice points about that reveal. First of all, it makes a lot of sense to me that the Brotherhood are this widespread, have this much manpower at their back. I want you to imagine for a moment real life. Okay, I know it's hard, but think about it. I want you to think about how many people in real life would willingly sign up if they felt like they could do something that had a purpose, that they could be part of a cause. It's not that hard to imagine, is it, right? Now imagine that alongside that, you also get regular meals and training, and you get to be treated like a better person than you otherwise were being treated before. You could see why joining the Brotherhood would be appealing even in real life. Now, out on top of that, let's say you're living in the wasteland, the capital wasteland, and let's say you're living in a metal shack that stinks, and the Brotherhood is like, we're recruiting new people. It makes perfect sense to me that their numbers would absolutely soar once they actually really started recruiting, and it would make a lot of sense for why they're able to make the leaps and bounds they are able to in the 10 years that have passed since Fallout 3. There's also a few hints here or there that they basically took over the pit, which, again, yeah, I could see that happening. Some people have really blasted me for being anti-Brotherhood here. And, I'm not going to call anyone out or try to even defend myself. That's not the point. I actually enjoy having different opinions for myself. But having replayed this, my opinion of the Brotherhood remains adamantly where it was. This is a group of militant dictators who want to establish a military dictatorship of basically, at best, a velvet prison of everyone else, where they practice a particular form of eugenics and their own interesting code of honor, which I happen to disagree with personally. Yeah. It probably doesn't help that I do have a decent amount of sympathy for ghouls, real ghouls, not feral ghouls, so. And what's funny is I've never heard this argument, but it occurred to me as I was going through this. Some people might be like, "Hey, well, you can't tell if it's a feral ghoul or a person ghoul." Yeah, you can. It's super obvious. But again, I've never even heard that argument. So maybe that's just a straw man argument. Um, so then there's the simulation section. It is ironic to me how Kellogg receives more characterization as an individual after he's dead than he did before. But it's good, it's some good stuff. We really learn more about him. His comment about happiness really hits hard. The idea that you only know what happiness is after you have now lost it. He has this great quote about, when you're really happy, you focus on all the petty crap that's going on in your life, and you think you're not actually happy. It's not till later you realize that was happiness. It's a great line. But on top of that, it helps to flesh him out as the embittered individual that he is. I got the very strong impression that Kellogg keeps going out of momentum more than anything else. It's not even like I'm the best at what I do or I must survive. He has actively gone out of his way to continue to exist, even though he has no actual reason to do so, and in fact, by all accounts, hates his life and himself. And thanks to his memories being, as intact as they are, he remembers lots and lots of aspects of his life. You get where I'm going with this? I really got the strong impression that it was just kind of he just turned off his brain, basically. I was like, yep, well, yeah, sure, I'll kill people, sure, why not? Okay, pay me, yep, okay, funny, food, yep. And I'm sure there was some professional pride involved in that, but by the time of the game actually happening, when he's been alive for over a century, I think by that point, basically all we had going was a shell. If I'm being 100% honest, though, I have a sneaking suspicion that part of the reason he kept going was because he literally didn't have a choice. I don't mean like, oh, if I quit, I'll be killed. I mean, I think some of the cybernetic implants that were going through him actually kind of forced him to keep going. He was excessively cybernetic, remember? This is kind of skipping ahead in my notes, but as an aside, we actually have a comment by Sean, who's like, I hated Kellogg, and I liked seeing him die as revenge for what he did, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't say it like that, but, that is basically what he says. And at the same time, if you read his own notes, which you have to hack into to get, you see, his more real thoughts, which is he's a useful asset, and I tend to keep using him as long as possible. Uh-huh. It also makes you wonder, but I don't want to get into the Sean stuff just yet. Let's rewind a little bit. It is also interesting to me because the arrangement between the Institute and Kellogg makes perfect sense. I hate to say this for like the 70th time on my show, but I love it when personal and political power marry together. The idea that someone who is an incredibly powerful mage gets the backing of a king of a kingdom. The mage could obliterate the king and all his people if he really wanted to, but then he wouldn't have, food or servants or materials or supplies or all the things that political power grants. He would just have his magic, right? So in this case, Kellogg is a damned good fighter who could probably, hold his own against most things in the wasteland, but he has the backing of the political power, in this case of the Institute. It actually would, in many ways, foreshadow the inevitable arrangement of the player character with whoever they decide to align themselves with. But again, I'll get to that later. It is a final pity to me that Kellogg's last comment that went through Nick was never followed up on. It felt like a perfect thing as a hook for a future quest, or maybe a companion quest, or even a DLC situated around Kellogg and going through, him taking over Nick, or him hopping to another body, something. But no, it's never followed up on. I really found that to be a disappointment. So radiation storms. First of all, radiation storms are terrifying. I actually had one by complete accident after doing a reload, no less. I was walking through and I was like, whoops, I forgot something. Reload, and then it was a radiation storm. Go figure. But I really like them. It makes a lot of sense. It's very consistent with the setting and in general, and just general physics. The idea that there would be massive storms carrying radioactive gunk from point A to point B. And I loved what they added to the game gameplay-wise, because they are actually a hazard, and they only last about 2 to 3 hours on average. I encountered very, very few of them in my particular playthroughs of both times I was going through the game. The only question I have is, why haven't we seen radiation storms before? That sounds like the kind of thing that would be semi-normal in a setting like Fallout, but I digress. But that brings us, of course, to the glowing sea. I have this note here that is just underlined twice. It says very atmospheric. I really don't know what else to add to that. I already kind of gushed about it. It is perfect combination of visuals and audio and music and just everything. Everything about that section is just, oh my god, it's horrifying walking through there. It is a very blasted hell kind of a thing, and it also serves as an excellent contrast, which is something we don't get all that often. In most of the Fallout games, there's a contrast between, standard wasteland and urban wasteland, but that's about it. In here, we actually have like 3 layers of wasteland. We've got the urban wasteland of downtown. We've got the suburban wasteland, which is most of the surrounding area, and then we've got the glowing sea, which is absolutely irradiated hell. And it's like another level, another layer of wasteland that I don't think we've ever actually seen on camera before. It's been hinted at, but we've never actually been presented with that, and it really helps to emphasize just how absolutely nuked certain chunks of the world still are to this day. And I'm not going to get into the radioactive isotope half-life thing. I'm not going to get into that. There's a plane. When you go through there's a plane that's crashed right towards the middle of the crater, or right past the crater, actually, excuse me. Now, I feel like I commented on this on the stream, but I had a theory as I was looking at that, because the plane is obviously shot down. Wouldn't it be interesting, in kind of an ironic sort of way, if that plane was the one that bombed the area, and was shot down and basically got off its nuke as it was going down? So in other words, that would explain why the main city area wasn't nuked, why the nuke was outside Boston proper. But the reason that's ironic is because that would also explain why the player character lived. Because if the nuke was closer, hell, even like 100 feet closer, it's very likely that all those people going down into Vault 111 would have been very, very dead. Food for thought. So there's a section pretty close after this where you have to go after a courser to get a courser chip. And coursers are talked up all over the place. Like, they're the top of the food chain, or the best ever. And they actually do some good stuff. Again, this is a good set-piece sequence. The gunners are going after this guy, right? And the gunners are fighting this one courser. And as you go through the area, there's a lot of scripted events that happen around you. And the gunners are basically losing. Now, you have to take out a lot of the gunners yourself, but this is an entire platoon of these guys. And I'll talk more about the gunners in just a moment, but these are the heavily armed guys. And you're having trouble, pushing, well, I was having trouble pushing through all these guys, and all their traps, and all their everything, and the courser is just wrecking them. And then you get to the top, and there's the courser. This is a fairly common method of building up a character. You build up a character by building up someone else, and then you have that someone else crushed by the character, and that actually establishes this character. That's what they do with the courser here. And I like that. And then, of course, you defeat the courser. In fact, when you talk about this to people and NPCs in several sections after this point, there are some cases where they actively don't believe you. In fact, in the Institute, later on, they actually think, oh god, great, now I have to go and do a diagnostic on every single generation of courser that's out there, because obviously there's something flawed with them to lose to you, or in general. But it helps to re-emphasize that point I mentioned earlier, that you are the apex predator of the setting. Let's talk about the gunners briefly. First of all, the gunners are a blatant copy of the Talon Company in almost every way. They are amoral, they shoot on sight, and they're much more heavily armed than standard raiders. There you go. It's an answer to the Oblivion problem. If you don't know what I mean by that, in Oblivion, you can be attacked by bandits as basically random enemies, radiant enemies, if you will, whenever. Even if you're level like 30 or something. So you could just be walking down the street, and all of a sudden a bandit, or not the street, being like a road, and all of a sudden a bandit pops out in like full Daedric, or not Daedric, Dremora armor, or ebony armor, with like a heavily powered weapon that might even be stronger than yours. They're like, ah, give me your stuff, And what they did with Fallout 3 and with Fallout 4 is they made it so that there was like a low tier enemy, raiders in both cases, actually. And then there was a high-tier enemy, the Talon Company and the Gunners in this case. On the one hand, I don't like the Gunners because they are basically default bad guys in many different ways. I mean, really, that is what they are. They are default bad guys who have no depth or complexity to them. In fact, it's not even 100% confirmed that they are actually from Vault 75. That's just something that we assume based on the evidence. For those of you not aware, Vault 75 was the hideously, disgustingly evil vault, excuse me for being redundant, where they were training children to be, very, very tough and strong, and the ones that were, acceptable were then cultivated for their DNA to seed the next generation, and then killed, cultivated to become the scientists to watch the next generation, or killed, and then fed to the young. It was a very messed up vault, as most of the vaults are, let's be honest with ourselves. But I guess I look at the Gunners and I just think from a setting perspective, from a thematic perspective, and from just a general world building perspective. There's so much you could do with that. Think about the political realities of having one organized unit, one clan, if you will, of bandits, of raiders, of whatever you want to call them, that has access to real hardware and real military guns and armament and everything like that. And that's never explored or even touched on. It's not even mentioned. They're just a higher tier bad guy who happens to be out to shoot you on sight because they needed a higher tier bad guy that wasn't super mutants. Literally my next note here is, speaking of political factions that are not explored, the Commonwealth super mutants. Now, in the interest of fairness, at least they go out of their way to explain what's going on with why there's super mutants here. Fallout 3 did that as well, actually, so that's kind of cool. Fallout 3 super mutants probably stopped existing a few years ago based on what was happening in Fallout 3. These ones are a little bit different. Some of the members of the Institute got a hold of the FEV and the ability to reproduce it, and they've been using it to artificially create super mutants by kidnapping people from the Wastelands for about a century. For a long frickin' time, is what I'm trying to say. So what we have here is super mutants that are a little bit different than most of them. They're a little bit smarter, they're a little bit more organized, and they're more capable of using tools and armaments. So they're a lot more dangerous than your typical super mutants. They're more inclined to organize with each other, and there's a lot more of them than there ever have been before. In terms of lore, there should be more super mutants here than there are anywhere else in the world, not counting anything we don't know about yet, of course. And yet again, from a setting perspective, thematic perspective, just a political reality, none of that is ever touched on. They're not really explored as a faction. The significance of their presence compared to the other forces that are moving and vying throughout the Commonwealth, that's never touched on even a little bit. They are, just like the Gunners, another group of bad guys that are there for you to fight that are harder than normal raiders. And that's it. It's kind of Voyager-y, if I think about it, really. It's great potential that is never followed through on. I actually thought, back before I knew that they were, back before when I thought that Fallout 4 was actually going to have expansions, I actually thought they were going to have the factions of the Commonwealth kind of a thing, because there's several that are presented there in the setting that weren't touched on in the vanilla game. Whatever, I guess. So, this is a good time to bring up one of my flaws with several of the factions in the game. The Minutemen, I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The Minutemen are kind of the exception to this, but the Brotherhood, the Institute as presented, and the Railroad are all extremists. And every single one of them is like, this to the point of exclusion of everything else, or this to the point of exclusion of everything else. And this is kind of true for most every faction, even the smaller ones in Fallout 4. I point to the Children of Adam in Far Harbor is actually a good example of this. The only way, gameplay-wise, spoiler for Far Harbor, 3, 2, 1, the only way to avoid, one of the violent options in Far Harbor, the only way to pacify the Children of Adam is either to murder one of the other groups, or to replace their leader with a duplicate who connives them into not murdering everyone. That's it. Those are the only options. That's how extreme they are. It's a little ridiculous, and might be another example of that turn your brain off rating. So let's talk about the companions really quick. I know this is a weird point to talk about it, but trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. So I don't have a lot of thoughts on the companions. I like most of them. Good voice acting, good presentation. I was a little disappointed on how few companion quests there were. I didn't even realize it until this playthrough. There's actually only 4 companion quests. Curie, Nick, Kate, and McCready each get a companion quest, and that's kind of it. Everything else is just development of the characters as they interact with you and talk about their past, kind of a thing. So there's Piper, first of all. I obviously do like Piper quite a bit. Piper and Nick are probably my favorites, with one exception. We'll get there, trust me. It's the one I'll talk about last. Um, the Piper feels a little Han Solo-y to me in a good way. She's someone who's not that great with a gun. She's not the apex predator. She's not a Kellogg or a Courser or a main character. She's someone, however, who is able to talk or think her way through a situation with her cunning and with her ability to be adaptive on the fly. And that's why she's still alive, despite the fact that she's been in fairly dangerous situations more than once. I also find it interesting that she has this dedication to the truth thing, which is similar to a problem several Wastelanders have, actually, which is the fixation problem, because of what happened with her father, and the fact that it was a very good thing for her to discover the truth in that matter. It actually led to the salvation of that settlement, right? I mentioned the fixation thing, though. I'm only going to touch on this briefly, but a lot of the characters in Fallout 4, and this makes sense, if I'm being honest, have a thing. One concept, one ideal, one whatever, and that's what they fixate on. In some cases, they're fleshed out characters in addition to that fixation, but in Piper's case, again, a fairly fleshed out character, it's still that fixation on the truth. Gotta find the truth. Which leads me smoothly into Nick. Now, he's, his fixation is very much, it's not quite on the truth so much as what I like to call complex facts. And I admit I stole that quote from Gordon in Batman Telltale because it was a fantastic freaking quote. The simple facts are not enough. Complex facts, that's what actually matters when it comes to really determining what happens in a situation. In other words, it's the definition of a detective, actually. It's very Garibaldi, if I will, and I think that's one of the reasons why I liked Nick so much. He was the kind of person who would listen to your information or listen to what's going on and be like, well, okay, this could imply this, but if we look deeper and think deeper, this is this is the information that's really significant at that moment. And he was very logically deductive. I really liked that. He's also a very fun, generally open kind of a character, and I like it because he gives his whole backstory in general, but also, even more of it thanks to the Far Harbor expansion, or DLC or whatever. And he talks about how it took a while for people to really start tolerating him. But what I like most about it is it really took one person to basically say, no, he's coming in and that's it, for everyone else to finally be like, fine, we'll tolerate him just because we have to, and I guess he's okay. And, the slow building, once one person lays down that first plank of an actual bridge of trust between him and the other denizens. I have a personal theory, too. I think that one of the reasons they trust him more and treat him as more of a person than the others is because he is so blatantly and obviously not human. One of the biggest things I noticed in the synth problem, especially in Diamond City, is the fact that the synths can replace people, like they do with the mayor of Diamond City, for example, and nobody even freaking caught onto that except Piper. But, they can replace people and you don't know it. And there's several really horrible instances that we get to find out about throughout the game of people who've been replaced with synths, and, oh yeah, Daddy's a lot nicer than he used to be, that kind of horrible, horrible stuff. And especially circumstances where it's like, yeah, once this experiment's done, we plan to kill the whole family, so there's no witnesses, that kind of thing. Institutes evil. I'll get to that, though, trust me. So that's the big threat there, right? That you don't know who's a synth or who's not, a very Battlestar Galactica kind of a thing. Nick is really obviously a synth. There's no hiding it. He doesn't try to hide it. And, it's the same way with Dima later on, actually. So people can look at him and say, yeah, he's a synth, but it's okay. He's our synth. We know he's a synth. We don't think he's some kind of infiltrator or spy or he's going to kill us or whatever. And I'm sure time and the fact that he was with them for so long and worked with them so well for so long kind of helped that out. The quest that he gives you to go after the gangster, thanks to his false memories from the original Nick Valentine, the human, kind of made me tilt my head a bit because it kind of helped to showcase what kind of a character Nick is, but I don't think it was necessary, as weird as that sounds. I already kind of knew the kind of character Nick was, but it showed it into contrast by having Winters, the gangster, who was very, very obviously like the opposite. This is someone who was so selfish and so stupid that in his mind, living forever as a ghoul, basically in isolation, was worth it to him. You know, the kind of person who would say, I don't want life, I want survival. And I want to have survival forever. So that way I'm the one who outlasts everyone. And it was worth it to him. So very severe aspects of pride and a lack of caring about anything that actually matters in existence. Nick is the exact opposite of that. He is very willing to debase himself if necessary, and he very much cares about doing things the right way rather than just taking the easy answer or going for things that, are base elements. And I like that. Deacon is an interesting character. I saw him twice before he's first actually introduced to you. Once in Diamond City and once in the Memory Den. I don't know if he's anywhere else. I wouldn't be surprised if he is. But I like that. It's a nice thing. I didn't catch it till my second time through. It's a nice way to emphasize how this character is a spy. Someone who is keeping an eye on you and major events in the world because that's his frickin' job. And he is probably one of the best fictional examples of a spy I've seen in a long time, especially in the Fallout setting. How do I put this? He's very charismatic. He's very open. He has no problem being like, hey, what's going on? He's very lighthearted in his presentation. He uses humor and interactions with others to put people at ease, because a spy works best, usually, when the people around them are at ease, so they're more likely to not suspect him, for example, or not sell him out, or not hurt him, or not suspect anything even worse than him just spying on them. I also like the fact that almost all of his presentation is fake. We don't actually know the true backstory of Deacon's character, and we probably never will, and that's one thing I'm actually happy for. It's one bit of backstory I wouldn't flesh out if I could. There's some of the stories he tells that you can kind of tell that bits and pieces of it are probably truth, but like the whole synth, oh my god, family thing, that kind of a thing. But I don't think we ever need to know the truth about him, because that's the whole point. It's kind of the Garrick thing over on DS9 all over again. The point is the lies. The point is he lies in how he feels, he lies in what he says, he lies about his past. Like I said, he's the perfect spy. We don't even know his true loyalties. He does seem to be fairly loyal to the Railroad. I'll give him that. But other than that, we don't know anything about him. And I like that. I don't have much else actually to talk about him, because that's really his main point. So let's move on to the next character, John Hancock. Now, he's interesting to me, because he is a very strangely black and white character. In a good way, though. What I mean by that is, if you are his friend, he's very jovial and very kind to you. If you are his enemy, screw you. And he's very black and white. There's like no in-between ground for him. And that makes sense, especially given what happened with what he thought was his brother, was actually the synth taking place of his brother, but you know what I mean. He's very stark, and that kind of stark mentality is the kind of person I would imagine being in a position of political power in the Fallout setting more. I'm a little surprised we don't see more characters that are that stark between friendly and viciously ruthless. That's the kind of thing that would work very well in a setting like this. You're on my side? We're cool. You're not on my side? Stab, stab, stab. He also strikes me as an extremely honest character. I don't think there's any moment where he tried to subterfuge or deceive or even just flat out lie. He was just like, nah. He's the kind of person who would walk up to you and say, hey, I hate you, to your face. Or, I'm not going to tell you that. That kind of an honesty thing. Preston. Preston is interesting in only one way to me. He's probably one of the least fleshed out companions that isn't a robot, because he is in many ways indicative of the follower mentality. Even though he was leader of the Minutemen, you notice he never called himself general, and he actually talks about that at one point in time. He doesn't want to be the leader. He's kind of, in many ways, he reminds me of a less fleshed out Alistair from Dragon Age Origins. I don't want to be king. I don't want to be leader. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes these kind of hard choices and makes these decisions. I want to follow. I have found a cause that I care about. I mentioned earlier the whole cause thing with the Brotherhood. It applies to the Minutemen as well. I have found a cause I believe in. I want to follow it. Please lead me. And it's so obvious with the way he basically hoists that title onto you. I've heard some people complain that you become the leader of the Minutemen too easily and too quickly, but I disagree. I think Preston was just waiting for the first person that qualified at all for that post and was like, "Here, you got the job now. I don't have to deal with this anymore." And as a result of that, not only is he a logical follower, as a result of a gameplay mechanic, but he's a nice contrast to most of the other companions who are a little more fleshed out. So I have Strong and X688 in the same note, because I have nothing to talk about them, really. They both feel very token to me. There's no quests about them. There's no characterization about them. And they're mostly there because they're there to be companions for people who are either hideously violent, that's Strong, or want to be with the Institute and still be evil, that's X688. I actually wonder if there was some cut content involving that. I don't know. Now, Dance is an interesting character, but mostly because I wonder when he was a synth. He tells this whole backstory about how he joined the Brotherhood and all that fun stuff, and why he hates synths. I wonder if that's completely fictitious. In other words, basically, was Dance replaced with a synth at some one point in time, or was he always a synth and those are fake memories? I don't actually know the answer to this question, but I do think it's interesting. He's one of the examples of a synth who doesn't know it, and he is such a fanatic and a bigot in his particular cause that when he finds out he's a synth, he actively asks you to kill him. He actively wants to die because of he hates what he is so much. Again, kind of the Battlestar Galactica thing there. I also think it's interesting, I kind of already mentioned this, but I find myself wondering if he was a deliberate plant. Because, like, for example, the mayor of Diamond City, he knows he's a synth. He sends back regular reports to the Institute, but Dance didn't. Was he a mistake? Is there like a switch they have for like know that you're a synth or don't know you're a synth? I don't know. I'm just speculating here. Then we have Codsworth. Now, Codsworth is interesting because he is very well acted. His voice actor does a great job. And he actually recorded an insane amount of lines in order to accommodate for all of the different names that he could say. And that's a nice gimmick, but that's about it. That's actually all I really have to say about Codsworth. He has his token little appearances in the beginning. He's there so that you know that it's been 2,000 million billion years. 210 years. And then he's there to be a companion right off the bat, in case you happen to want one. Because I know several players very much want companion gameplay in an Elder Scrolls-style game, like Fallout 4. I don't, personally. I actually get rid of companions as soon as I can. But that's just my preference. I get that. So from a purely gameplay perspective, Codsworth makes a lot of sense at being, oh, quick, here, have a companion right off the gate. No, like literally, it's like the first thing, before you even fight anything greater than a radroach, here's a companion. But it would have been nice if they'd done anything to actually make him a more interesting character. Then we've got Curie. All I have to say here about Curie is that she is grossly underutilized as a character. I like the actress, even though her accent is whew, but that's actually done on purpose in character, so I kind of like that. I like her backstory. Her quest is very bland. I mean, I'm just going to tell you, her quest is, please get me a synth body. Okay. Hey, I have a synth body. The end. That's it. She wants to develop more as a sapient individual, and so she does. And she gets a better body to do so. The end. I mean, there's really nothing else there. She is, however, probably the best example of droid effect in the entire Fallout series, in my opinion. I can't think what they're called. It's the same model as Codsworth, or same type of unit as Codsworth. But, left alone for 2 freaking centuries, or not left alone, excuse me, but left active for 2 centuries with interactions with other people until they finally passed out, it makes perfect sense to me that something like that would eventually become someone like that, if you follow. I have nothing else to say about her. McCready was interesting. He was a nice connection to Fallout 3, and there is a little bit of a nice theme in him. I mentioned that sometimes themes would crop up here or there. There's a little bit of a generational theme in part of the main quest with regards to Sean and the main character. And that theme also, this is the one other point where there's like a bleed over of theme, because that theme is with McCready. He was a loud-mouthed, foul-mouthed, violent little bastard back when he was in Little lamplight. And now he's the same kind of person, but he has a kid, and he really cares about his kid so much that we never see his kid on camera, ever. I checked. And his whole side quest involving getting him, getting the medicine for his child makes a lot of sense. It actually, I kind of had this headcanon of going to the institute being like, here, can you cure this? So we could cure his son. But I like it because it shows that he is trying to be a better person. Not because he really wants to be or anything like that, but because he wants to be a better example for his son, so his son doesn't turn into the kind of bastard that he knows he is. And I kind of like that. That leads us to the last character. Now, I mentioned Piper and Nick were my favorites with one exception. This is the exception. I wasn't quite sure about this the first time through, but on replay, it's obvious to me that the most effort by a huge margin was put into this companion, far more than any of the other ones, Kate. Which is funny, because Kate is a drunk, drugged-up, violent, horrible, depraved... Well, not depraved, but like depraved upon. Tragic is the word I'm looking for. Character. She's gone through hell in her life, and she has had terrible, terrible things happen to her many times. And the way she joins us is you literally buy her as a frickin' slave, for God's sakes. Now, and then you could, of course, free her, because we're not horrible people, but you get the point. But she is by far the most fleshed out character and the most human. I don't have much else to say about that in particular. She is tragic, of course, but what I find interesting about her is she is a third path. Most characters, when they go through hell, when they go through a horrible thing, I've talked about this before, they either come through it with the best of themselves or the worst of themselves. They either become a much better person or a much, much worse person as a result of it, right? She did something in between. She stopped giving a crap. She went through hell and walked out of it, and just it's not even walked out of it. She was dragged out of it. She's like, yeah, whatever. There's a sense of apathy about her, and one of the things I like most is we can actually galvanize her, not only through our interactions with her, but through her companion quest, which is by far my favorite companion quest, and very impacting and very emotional quest. It's actually the only companion quest I enjoyed redoing for this particular replay, that really showcased that we had gotten through to her and given her a reason to care, because she never had one before. Now, I admit, this actually probably sounds familiar to anyone who's played Mass Effect 2. Jack, over in Mass Effect 2. Kate is Jack. There's the one-to-one is very clear. But I do like that type of character, and I still think it was very well presented, very well acted, very well written. As an aside, Vault 95 can go die in a goddamn fire. I mentioned how Vault 75 was pretty bad. Vault 95 might actually be worse. My last page is almost entirely about the Institute. I literally have one? I have one note after the Institute before we get to the Far Harbor stuff. It really is one note. It's got a couple of sub-bullet points, so I guess we could say one note with 4 bullet points. I'll get there. So first of all, again, this game very clearly establishes that we are the guy. We are very powerful, very strong, apex predator kind of situation, right? It is very logical, then, that the Institute would want another person, another Kellogg, basically, like Kellogg, in order to be their agent, in order to be someone to help enforce the Institute's will on the upper plane. It makes sense for 2 reasons. Number one, they want someone who is that skilled, that good, someone who could take down a courser in order to be able to do the things that they can't, in order to be able to interact with things that are far more dangerous and horrible than they actually have comprehension of. And number 2, well, they're not going to go topside. Are you kidding me? I'm not going up there. Screw that. That's peasants' work. There is a huge amount of classism in the Institute, but I'll get to that in just a second. I also love the fact that you need political power to build the teleporter to get in. What I mean by that is you have to ally with one of the factions, the Brotherhood, the Railroad, or the Minutemen, in order to be able to get that thing going. And I love that, because not only does it kind of make sense from a gameplay perspective, you just don't have all the parts, and hell, screw the parts, you don't have the expertise to build this thing in your brain, right? You need help to do that. But it also makes sense from a lore perspective twice. First of all, it does very clearly show the benefits of political power to someone who is personally powerful. And number three, this is really important. I think it was deliberate. I think this situation was engendered deliberately on behalf of Sean. Because what Sean wants, remember, in addition to meeting their parent again, is a successor. He wants the parent to take over for him. Whether you accept that or not, that is his desire. And he let you out of Vault 111. Remember, he's the one who activated your cryopod. And he's the one who did a couple of things to help guide you to this point. And he's the one who wants you to reach the Institute and take it over. It's not enough to be an excellent killer to do that. It's not enough to be a survivor to do that. He wanted you to demonstrate actual leadership skills and unifying certain aspects of the disparate and broken and, desolate aspects of the wasteland in order to make something as amazing as a frickin' teleporter. That shows very clearly the kind of leadership skills that the player character can have, and thus makes them the perfect candidate. If the player character manages this, by logical definition of having managed it, they are now capable of becoming his successor. It's a nice little point, and very subtle. If I may be so bold, the Institute feels like the peak of the game. In my opinion, most of the main story building up to the point in which you enter the Institute feels like it is all a build-up for that moment. And this is the ultimate set piece. It wouldn't surprise me if this was like the first thing they wrote when they first sat down to make Fallout 4, is the Institute scenes. And all the dialogue and all the visuals and all. Again, it's those the visuals, the audio, the characters, and the moments in the Institute are perfect. I love that section of the game. I have almost no complaints. Almost none. Like, if I was to chop away all the rest of Fallout 4, but just leave the Institute section alone, it wouldn't just be a net positive, it would be an overwhelming positive. You follow? It is brilliantly crafted. Real strong effort is made to make the Institute feel completely different. Different from the Commonwealth, different from the Wasteland, different from Fallout. Different from all the aspects of Fallout. We've seen Fallout clean before, with the Enclave, with the Brotherhood. We've seen Alien in Fallout before. This feels different than all of that. In fact, it has been commented before, the music in there feels very Mass Effect-y. Einonzer, of course, nails it with the song that's in the Institute. But the whole thing takes on an almost surreal tint, and lots of effort is made to actually flesh out the Institute as an organization. There's lots of internal politics going on, but it's all childish. To explain part of what I mean by that, there's a severe pragmatism and lack of compassion in the Institute, which I'll talk about a little bit more as how it involves Sean in particular. But none of the Institute are really attached to anything, other than their work, of course. They don't understand what bad means. They don't understand what difficulty means or hardship. They are so clearly distinguished from the rest of the Wasteland by things like there's so many scenes. I only wrote down 2, but there's like a dozen or so scenes in the Institute of just those. You're walking by and a scripted event is happening, where someone was. The 2 I wrote down was someone was complaining about the floor not being spotless. Not that the floor was dirty. That there were a couple of bits where the floor wasn't perfectly spotless. And there's another section where this guy really wants this one particular food supplement. It's his favorite flavor. Can't I have it? And they both get very upset and very angry about the fact that these extremely minor problems, these are so petty compared to problems of things like, I might be eaten tomorrow. I might mutate into a nightmarish, horrible abomination. I might die of starvation. Irradiation might make me puke up my own guts. I might kill myself because of despair. You get the point. These are the normal things that people face up in the Wasteland, even now, even with the pseudo urbanized Wasteland, where they actually have like settlements and cities and stuff. They still have to worry about that crap every day. It gives such a severe chasm, intentional reference, between the Institute and everyone else, and it's brilliantly done. I also have to give massive props to Tony Amendola. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I actually have a lot of respect for the actor. He's the gentleman who voices Sean, a.k.a. the father. And he perfectly nails the role. Sean comes across as someone who is not evil in the traditional sense of the word, but someone who very clearly and demonstrably lacks a concept of compassion. I mentioned earlier the lack of compassion in the Institute in general. They don't understand that kind of a concept. They probably don't even understand what the word ethics means or morality. It's very much just about the work, and all that matters is the progress, right? It's kind of like the space pirates over in Metroid. All that matters is the results. So he is the perfect example of someone who's been raised in that environment. He doesn't care about basically anything other than the work, and at the same time, he does hang on to a few tiny little threads of sentimentality that help to give him a little bit more depth. He obviously did have disdain for Kellogg. He obviously does care about his parent, and he obviously does care about the future of the Institute, if not humanity itself. The whole thing he does with the child Sean is an excellent example of that. He leaves a note saying, please be, a father/mother to this child. He has been programmed to think that he is your son. Little things like that, tiny little bits, help flesh him out tremendously. He is, of course, also an incredibly pragmatic person. Think about this for a moment. Really think about this. He is about to meet his parent for the first time ever. He's never met his parent before. And he is 60 freaking years old. Okay? 61, excuse me. And he is this historic occasion and the parent, meanwhile, he knows this because he's got his spine ripped topside, has been going through hell and back to reach him. And then the parent finally reaches him, and rather than any of the emotional things you might imagine there, or the significant, oh God, it's you, or I can't believe this, or anything like that, he decides it would be an interesting moment to use as an experiment. And from a purely pragmatic perspective, he's right. That kind of circumstance would never come again. He would never be able to replicate that experiment. So he decides to use the opportunity to do the experiment. And then when he sees the results, he's like, okay, this is the real me, hi. That's the kind of character that Sean really is. It's difficult for me to label him evil, but at the same time, it does fit him very well. Kind of the apathetic variety, except not quite. It's a very nice blend. Very, very, very well done character. I also love how he justifies the use of Kellogg. And you talk to him, and he's like, it's better than letting him loose on the Commonwealth. There's other options, right? Everything he says not only tries to justify his actions and the actions of the Institute, but it demonstrates something very clear in his mentality. A lack of accountability, which ties into what I mentioned earlier, lack of perspective. It's hard to hold yourself accountable for your actions if you have no idea what the actual impacts of those are. Like, I genuinely believe most of the Institute, with like 2 exceptions, don't even understand what consequence really means. Again, it's that childish perspective. And so, I mentioned here, the Institute is brilliantly, brilliantly done. Where's my note? Hang on, I wrote it down. The first thing, okay, so the first things that Sean talks about when you first enter the Institute, it's like he says, hi, I figured you'd get here. And then, like, the next thing out of his mouth is trying to justify the Institute and the actions they take and their terrible reputation and the frankly evil things they've been doing. I mentioned how they've been kidnapping people for a century. Kidnapping people against their will to turn them into super mutants for the sake of experimentation. Replacing people with synths in order to better control environments. And, again, there's that horrible, horrible example of, we need to test the soil in this area, so let's replace one of the farmers with a synth. Test, test, test. Okay, test complete. Kill all the family. We don't want any witnesses, after all. That's atrocious. Which brings me to my next point. I honestly wonder if a lot of effort was put into making the Institute evil so they wouldn't seem like the obvious choice. Because if the Institute wasn't just really, really evil, there would be no dilemma, really, as far as which faction to back, in my opinion. I'll get more into that in a minute. I have a couple other tiny little things here. First of all, interesting little factoid. Sturgis, tell her. No, Sturgis is a synth. I'm serious. It's never brought up in the plot, but if you look in the game files, he is a synth. And he will drop synth materials if you manage to kill him properly. Makes the whole him being the person who makes the teleporter thing kind of interesting, doesn't it? There's a comment he makes about how the Commonwealth has nothing to fear from the Institute. Did I mention the kidnappings and the experimentation and the mass murder earlier? I did mention that, right? Okay, good, good. There's a note, I actually already referenced this earlier, but there's also a note about how you can tell one of the people, I took down a courser, and he's like, oh, God. I mean, it could, without even thinking about it, he automatically assumes, great, there's some horrible glitch, I'm going to have to go back and fix all the glitches just because there's this one fucking glitch. And that actually really helps flesh out just how screwed up they are. Then there's a character called Allie. I like Allie. She's probably more grounded than most of the characters in the Institute. She's the only one I wrote down her name. She's one of the chief engineers. It makes a lot of sense to me that a practical engineer, aka someone who is actually physically making stuff work and maintaining it, would be a more grounded individual than more of a, say, theoretical engineer, right? Or a physicist or something like that. No offense to anybody in either thing, but it would make sense that someone who has to physically make something work would be more a grounded individual than others. And she does come across as a nicer individual, except even she is extremely anti-synth and extremely lack of compassionate, just like the rest of the Institute. She's still very Institute. This brings me to the end of the game. Like I said, I have one bullet point after this point, because from this point on, the game kind of... I'm going to use an analogy here. I mean no offense to anybody by this, but I'm just going to use it. I want you to imagine like there's a big hill, and the plot of Fallout 4 is like this slightly overweight person, like me, trundling to the top of the hill, and they finally get to the top of the hill, and they're like, yes, I did it, and they're panting, and they're gasping, and there's a motorcycle going by, but they did it, by God, they made it to the top, and they feel accomplished, and this is the Institute scene, which, again, is almost perfect. It is poetry. And then the rest of the game is like the kid suddenly trips and falls all the way back down the hill, but not even like in a dignified way, it's just kind of roughly tumbling flob over flob until they get back down to the end of the hill. The rest of the game's crap, is what I'm trying to say. The main quest dissolves almost immediately, and virtually all of the side quests from this point on that are not some of the scripted event stuff are purely radiant. And, I mean, I guess I already said that, but whatever. And then it boils down to the choice. Dun, 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 dun. You must choose. And in some way it will affect the future, even though it never has before. Trust us. I almost feel like this was an attempt to ape New Vegas. Because in New Vegas you could choose, and that had a very significant effect on the setting and how events went. And you had completely different quest chains to do that. You don't really have that different of quest chains in this one. I mean, there are different quests, but they don't really feel different from a gameplay perspective to me. So let's talk about our options. We got the Brotherhood. So they're into eugenics, they're bigoted, and they're in favor of a military dictatorship. They also have lots of numbers and lots of industry. So from a militarily perspective, they're going to win, right? Thing is, they are in no way fit to deal with any kind of threat that is not coming at them with guns blazing. Also, I don't think any kind of order they would establish is one that I would want to live in. So the Brotherhood's off the list. If I could be so bold, honestly, I think the Brotherhood as presented here are basically just the Enclave with a different name. I mean the modern Enclave, not the original Enclave, to make that clear. So then we got the Railroad. Okay. Well, first of all, the Railroads are extremists, who are very much, yeah, every synth, and we must kill everyone who is against a synth, usual extremist perspective. But there's one much bigger problem with the Railroad. They're not really a faction. They're a group of people who have an ideology they care about, but all they're about is freeing synths. They have no long-term plan or political agenda or idea with what to do with anything. They're just there to free synths. That doesn't lead to society or civilization or the future in any way, shape, or form. So they're out. The Minutemen. Now this is an interesting one. I honestly really feel like the Minutemen were designed to be an aping of the NCR, because they kind of are in its infant form. The Minutemen have all of the benefits and detriments of the NCR, again, in its infancy, because they're a group of people who are organized in order to try and help organize other people into a unifying force. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's the definition of a frickin' government. And the idea of variance between civilian and military leadership, and the settlements which help provide support for the military, which then helps protect them. And you can see the framework there if you really take a step back and look at it. The Minutemen, if the Institute was not an option, would be my default option to pick, because they actually have a plan for the future, unifying the wasteland, connecting the settlements together, increasing not just the ability for survival, but the quality of living for the people there, trying to cut down on the super mutants, trying to cut down on the raiders, that kind of a thing. And eventually, if allowed to grow, I have no doubt the Minutemen would turn into, the Eastern equivalent of the NCR. But that brings us to the Institute. So much effort is made to make the Institute unlikable and horrifically evil, as I already mentioned, because if that effort was not made, again, I think most people would only do the other endings just to see what they were. The Institute is such an obvious choice. The level of tech and the different levels of tech. It's not, I've talked about this before. People seem to think that technological advancement is just one thing. It could be argued very strongly that the Brotherhood of Steel is more militarily technologically advanced than the Institute is, and I would agree with that. But the Institute is advanced in many different fields. These people have medicine, they have matter transportation, they have power generation, they have recycling to an extreme degree, they have the ability to purify water and soil and food. These people have insane levels of tech in many fields. To throw that away from me seems so criminal that it would be difficult for me to accept such a concept. Now, if the option was to join the Institute, I could only justify that if the idea was to basically eventually conquer the Institute, to take it over from within, and then try to very carefully, you can't just introduce this thing into something like the Wasteland, but very carefully and very precisely add the technological advancements and the purification of the soil, the purification of the water, the medical advancements, trying to aid in the surrounding wasteland, bit by bit, trying to slowly improve the quality of life for everyone in order to ensure that this technology is benefiting mankind, rather than a bunch of eggheads who are upset that their food is the wrong flavor. The fact that we are offered the reins, the leadership of the Institute, makes this choice mandatory in my mind. We are the player character, the apex predator. No one else in the Institute is going to be able to bring us down in a one-on-one fight, and we've demonstrated we have leadership capabilities, as I mentioned earlier. All we have to do is be careful in balancing the politics, and let's be honest, the other 4 divisions are already kind of at each other's throats, so keeping them into the point where they can't really unify against us is not going to be hard. So we just have to be very careful, very precise in balancing the 4 of them until we have enough control so that we can start moving and helping the surface without opposition from within. And it would be a long and difficult battle. But here's the thing. The level of tech, the level of advancement, the level of benefit that the Institute could provide for everyone topside is so through the roof that it absolutely supersedes any other possibility for me. I can't possibly imagine picking any other faction other than the Institute. And if I'm being blunt, I think that's kind of a flaw of the storytelling. I think the Institute were made so good, and then they're like, oh crap, quick, make them super evil. But then they still give you the capacity to take over from within. So it's like, well, okay, now you're in charge of the organization, let's make them not evil. I feel like they didn't really think this one through. I feel like there's no moral choice here, is what I'm trying to say. It's, do you benefit mankind a lot, long term? Do you benefit mankind, or do you join the Brotherhood or the Railroad? And those are your choices. That doesn't really feel like a big moral choice to me. But then again, Bethesda's not that great about moral choices, unless you're playing the Pit, or, wonderful segue, Far Harbor. I don't have much to say about Far Harbor, if I'm being honest. But it's good. I feel like I've already talked a lot. It has wonderful atmosphere. It really does. It is probably the second most atmospheric thing I've seen in Fallout 4, just after the Glowing Sea. I find Kasumi interesting because how many people do you think would actually think they're a synth if it was possible? Like, how many people in real life, how many of you would you question if you were really human, if it was possible to not be really human? If it was possible that you were a synth, or a clank, or whatever they called them in Battlestar Galactica, and you just didn't know it. The signs of not really fitting in or having odd dreams. I mean, those are the signs? Really? So every teenager in the world is a synth. You get my point. The trappers, let's talk about them really quick. The trappers are crap. They are literally copy-paste raiders, or actually copy-paste gunners, really. But what really weirds me out about them is not only the fact that they're not fleshed out in any way, shape, or form, but the fact that they have, like, no dialogue. Even the raiders had dialogue to help flesh them out as characters. No interesting things about them whatsoever. No real story aspects to them. There's no women. I know that's a weird thing to point out, but there are no female trappers. It's just bizarre. They're just bad guys. They're there to be the default bad guys for the island. It's lazy. I don't like it. So then there's the situation with Cassie. Let's let's segue for a moment here. Let's talk about something else really quick. I mean, why is it that this island is so doomed? It has this horrible fog, which carries radiation with it, which is never explained, by the way. They never actually explain the fog properly. And yet it's so comparatively prosperous compared to the rest of the Commonwealth. Other than the big doom creatures, this is a place with good resources, good health. They have decent food. Overall, the place is much less of a wreck than the mainland is. And that brings me to my big point. This is why I have a hard time actually calling this an expansion, because it's got great atmosphere, but it's extremely set-piece, just like the rest of Fallout 4 is. First of all, each little individual quest is great, but it involves a big old trek across an island that feels extremely empty. There's not a lot of stuff to explore on this island, not like most of the rest of the game even. And unlike the main game, when you're trekking from point A to point B, nothing gets in your way. It's just a trek through a bunch of crap. Occasionally you'll fight a random group of mobs. Otherwise, it's just a long, boring trek. It's padding. If it felt very empty to me, very set piece again. And there's a lot of questions that aren't really fulfilled. Why are there so many trappers here? We're talking hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds. Why are they so well equipped? What is the fog? Why is it worse now? Now, my point is, there's other questions. I'm not going to go down the whole list I wrote down. But all of these questions can be answered if we bothered to try. But no effort is made by the game to bother to explain these things. It's just, yep, Mystery Island, basically. Just soak in the atmosphere. And again, turn off your brain entertainment. And I feel like that's one of the biggest reasons why Far Harbor kind of failed for me. I did enjoy it, but I only enjoyed it when I turned my brain off, if that makes any sense. A couple more thoughts here, really quick. The quest design felt a little bit MMO-y. What I mean by that is, like, you get one quest in this area, and if you do this one quest says, well, you can also do these other two quests. And if you do those three quests, then a whole bunch of new quests open up in the area that weren't even available before. And this is true for basically all three of the factions, the Acadians, the Far Harborians, and the Children of Adam, and that's how that works. And you also have to build up your rep with the Children of Adam to even really do their endgame quests. I liked the Mariner as a character. She's probably the character that really was fleshed out most for me throughout this course. She had a fairly human reaction to having this illness. By the way, I would love the idea of the Institute curing her too. And the invasion threats, the squabbling, the PC. It was an interesting demonstration of a character who, I don't have a better way to put it, was very human. She wasn't a good guy. She wasn't a bad guy. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't evil. She was just a person with all the flaws and benefits that implies. And I loved how she wanted to go out on a bang for the Red Death thing and finally found it and killed the Red Death. And she gets back and it's like, what do we do? I lied, by the way. I lied. Because A, I don't want them to make fun of this poor girl who has already sacrificed so much for them. And B, we did get rid of a serious threat, even though it wasn't a threat for us. It is a threat to naval men in the area, right? So we did do something. I liked the Mariner. I I love the irony of Dima asking the player character if you're a synth. Since if our first memory of this game is the beginning of the game when the bombs fall. And that's the earliest memory you can mention to him, because that's the earliest thing we see on camera. It's a nice little touch there. I love the virus section when you go through the whole computer terrain stuff. I don't just like it because it's a nice little shift from standard gameplay. I don't just like it because it's going through the Matrix thing. Several other games have done that recently. Mass Effect 3 did that, for example. Deus Ex, Mankind Divided did that as well. I like it, though, because it was a unique way to make the build mechanic. They actually used the engine you use to build settlements as a puzzle-solving thing. It was creative, it was inventive, and it was very well done. And I loved going through those sections, especially the last one, which took me several minutes to solve. I liked it a lot. So that brings us to our last point, and why the whole morality thing tied into this. God, I'm going on so long. The background may be about to loop. I didn't think I was going to be talking this long. Let's talk about Dima and the morality of Dima. Dima's an interesting character, and probably the thing that really sells Far Harbor for me the most is Dima, the character, because he is a very childlike perspective on morality for someone who is over a century old. And that makes sense for someone who has to constantly offload his memories thanks to limited storage space, basically. The moral dilemma there is much stronger of a one. Basically, you have the choice of wiping out one or two groups involved in the triad of the people who are disagreeing with each other, or there's one path to make it so that everyone makes peace with each other. That path involves murdering the leader of the children of Adam, replacing him with a synth, and then working with the already synth replacement leader of Far Harbor for someone who was also murdered in Far Harbor in order to basically force the factions to be at peace with each other. I love that because that is a real ethical dilemma. Cold calculus will tell you that that is the correct decision 10 times out of 10. You know, we kill one person to save all these other people. Done. You know, no, there's no question there. But that's why I call it an ethical dilemma. Is this the right thing to do? Dima himself was so horrified at the thought of killing someone, at the memory of killing someone, the memory of doing these horrible things, that Dima actually literally locked those memories away and never wanted to interact with them again. And yet, when reintroduced to those memories, Dima admits this is probably something I would still do. So it's not like this is one of those, mind control situations where the character can be thought to be, not complacent in their own actions. Or complicit, excuse me, not complicit in their own actions. Dima would still do this. Dima did do this, and Dima would do this again. In fact, asks you to help him do it again. There's the loop, by the way. Sorry about that. I really didn't think I'd be talking this long. And I like that because now it's upon you to decide what it is you to do. Do you think it is more correct to ensure peace between these different factions for now? Do you think it is more correct to not compromise your morality? Do you think it's correct to compromise your morality only to a certain extent? Do you not give a crap and just wipe out one of the factions? You have an actual gray array of choices here, and none of these are the right thing to do. And I like that. It's the pit all over again. There's no right choice here. It's the one true moral choice we have to make in all of Fallout 4, and I really, not counting the stuff I had in play, and I like that. I really, really enjoy the idea of having to deliberate on that. Now, so that brings me to an interesting point. Thinking about it extensively, I finally decided that ultimately I would probably go ahead and do this horrible deed of murdering a man, not an innocent man, in order to replace him, in order to make a fake peace. That's another aspect of the dilemma, by the way. You are not making real peace. These people are not actually coordinating each other. They are being forced to by someone else. It's kind of the brotherhood thing, right? But at the same time, the other perspective to take on that, you remember the mayor, the original mayor of Diamond City? The one who reached out the hand to Nick? If he hadn't pushed, if he hadn't made everyone else tolerate Nick, they would never have grown to tolerate Nick on their own, right? And that's the other side of the perspective. If someone doesn't lay down that first plank, the bridge can never be made. So these two leaders forcing these two factions, these two fake leaders, forcing these two factions into a fake peace could, theoretically, lead to a real peace over time. Or maybe it couldn't, because after all, the children of Adam have a completely different ideological view from the Far Harbor, because they think the radiation is good, and everyone else in the world, well, all the other people in the world think it's bad. So maybe that's something that couldn't happen anyways. So there's several different ways to look at this, right? So that's what I was going to do. I finally decided, I'm willing to accept this horrible act and hope that there's a possibility of these people having real true peace and true actual coordination with each other in the future. Thing is, I kind of made a mistake and accidentally killed one of their kind, and it turns out there's no going back from that. Or at least not that I saw. There was no way to unhostile with the children of Adam. So the only way to progress was to launch the nukes from the nucleus and wipe out the children of Adam. My bad, guys. Didn't mean to kill them all. Hashtag not evil. But that's actually how that ended up going down. I had to read how, and watch some videos on how the other sides of the other ways that that could unfold went. I also convinced Kasumi to go home because, and I admit I cheated on this. I looked into it and found out that Kasumi is not a synth, and you can prove that 100% in in game terms. However, as an aside, even if Kasumi was a synth, it doesn't matter at that point, does it? She's not a synth that is being actively controlled. We can prove this in-game. We could go to the Institute, and there's no record of her, and nobody's giving her orders. So she's off the grid, even if she is a synth. So, oh, you can find out the same thing if you go to the railroad, by the way. So even if she is actually a synth, it doesn't matter. She is still Kasumi at this point in time. And whatever happened to the original Kasumi no longer matters because this Kasumi is innocent in that and is still the daughter that they have been raising for however many years since she was put into their care. So even if she had been a synth, I still would have encouraged her to go home. That's everything. That's everything I've got about Fallout 4. My throat hurts like hell. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm going to go relax for just a little bit, and then I'm going to start working on my next one. I'll see you guys next time.